So the title of my talk, as Adafali mentioned, is No Trespassing, Bodies and Beaches for Sale in the Contemporary Caribbean. Today we're talking about tourism, sex tourism, and beach privatization. And what I mean by that is a process literally where you cannot access the beaches if you are a resident of that island. So let's move forward. Today, we're looking at two novels, Tiffany Anique's Land of Love and Drowning, here on the left, published in 2014, and Nicole Dennis-Benn's Here Comes the Sun, on the right, just came out this past July. Both texts disrupt the notion of paradise. So before we start, I really want to interrogate what paradise means. In The Difference Place Makes, Angeletta Godin says that the term Caribbean denotes a specific geographic locale and connotes paradise, relaxation, and adventure. Herein the myth of the Caribbean is born. And the word myth is so important here. Today, I want to address how the two novels, along with films such as Life in Debt and Jamaica for Sale, work to disrupt the notion of paradise. We're talking about an exotified image of the Caribbean, but that image is a myth that largely masks the conditions that residents face. It has long been portrayed as an exotic, resource-filled region. Think of advertisements. The Corona ad shows a hammock swaying in the breeze. Royal Caribbean shows huge ships that you can enjoy food 24 hours a day. That's not true to what happens in the Caribbean, and that's not the truth that the residents live. The Caribbean is seen as a land of beauty, both of its inhabitants and its natural resources. But this has spurred the growth of tourism and the companion industry of sex tourism. Today we're looking at how Anique's Land of Love and Drowning and Here Comes the Sun disrupt the paradise myth. Anique and Dennis-Benn detail the consequences of trespass upon women's bodies and the land that they call home. Overall, these two texts question permissible access or ownership. Although the authors highlight the impact of mass tourism and beach privatization, this issue is not specific to the Caribbean. It's happening worldwide. Instead, I find that these novels reflect larger questions regarding social norms and debate surrounding access to public land. Land of Love and Drowning and Here Comes the Sun show a very different version of paradise than you might think of. In these works, paradise is readily available to tourists while residents are left without refuge. By juxtaposing micro and macro exertions of power, the authors point to female sexuality as susceptible to scrutiny and exploitation, while land use is largely unregulated. At the heart of both novels is a critical discussion of tourism. While tourism is one of the most important economic sectors for many Caribbean countries, studies show that tourism has vast social and psychological consequences for residents. Most notable is the growth of sex tourism, an industry that is promoted on the image of an exotified woman. According to scholars such as Kamala Kempadu, sex tourism occurs when an adult tourist travels to a non-home location. The most prevalent form occurs when a female sex provider is intimate with a male sex tourist. Tourism and sex tourism are multi-billion-dollar industries. Kempadu explains, territories that once served as sex havens for colonial elite are today frequented by sex tourists, and several of the island's economies now depend upon the region's racialized and sexualized image for revenue. While my talk focuses on the emotional and environmental impact of land development, my longer treatment of these works addresses the complex relation of race and class, and also takes a look at the destruction of the Caribbean landscape as being a form of trauma for residents. The growth of tourism, we cannot mistake, has implications for natural resources. Most of the income generated by guests never reaches residents. Also associated with the growth of tourism is the trend towards beach privatization, where hotels are limiting access for residents to come onto the beaches. And here we have a license plate from the US Virgin Islands. The Virgin Islands is known as America's paradise. But in the Virgin Islands, beach privatization led to a national beach access movement, which tried to protect the public's ability to gain access to the shoreline. This movement is fictionalized in the novel Land of Love and Drowning. Anique's novel raises questions of access, both to female bodies and to island beaches. Her text is set on the eve of the transfer of the islands of St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix from Danish to American rule in 1917. And here we have the islands on the left. And if you're not familiar, if you're not familiar with that area, We see Puerto Rico on the far left in the right slide, and then the US Virgin Islands in the context of the British Virgin Islands. The novel complicates the definition of ownership, what it means to own a piece of land or to have power over another person. In particular, Yannick details a father's lust for his daughter, Iona, against the political backdrop of the transfer of the Virgin Islands. The author utilizes the space of the beach and the politicized movement to reclaim that space in order to highlight the trespass of bodies and land. In both cases, the overreach of power is thwarted, beach access is restored, and Owen Arthur, who is Iona's father, suffers an untimely death. Ultimately, the novel illustrates the cost of crossing individual and cultural boundaries. Yannick's novel, her first full-length fiction work, is set on the islands of St. Thomas, St. Croix, and Anegada, the childhood home of Iona's mother, and the place that the Spanish named the Drowned Land because it has a history of drowning ships. And here's Anegada, which in fact is a real island. It's a very small island, and there's a reef that surrounds the island, which in fact does crash a lot of ships. Like Jamaica, the Virgin Islands was transformed by tourism in the 1960s. Today, the island is one of 5 primary destinations for all tourists visiting the Caribbean. More than 1 million tourists visit St. Thomas each year. Like Jamaica, the Virgin Islands cater to tourists. Marketing materials for Jamaica and the Virgin Islands feature sun-loving people lounging on warm, white sands of island beaches. In contrast to this image, the novels we're discussing today position the environment as being under assault. The events the authors detail are rooted in experience. One example of this is the fact that by 1970, this is the quote on the left, only 2 of more than 50 beaches on the island of St. Thomas were open to the public. Although the Open Shorelines Act of 1971 allowed public use of the coastal zone, access is still not legally mandated. And the image on the right is just depicting the popular beaches, certainly not all 50, but still we have the public having difficulty accessing these beaches. In Land of Love and Drowning, Yannick parallels public and private regulation. For the women in the novel, sexuality operates as an object of regulation that prompts them to cover, quote, that which should not be exposed, end quote. For instance, Antoinette, who is Iona's mother, attempts to constrain her daughter's sexuality when she instructs the teenage Iona to pull her dress down. Specifically, Antoinette asks Iona to adjust her dress, quote, so it covered the knees at least, this is freedom, end quote. With this exchange, Yannick illustrates that the simple act of being born female situates sexuality as a liability and women as responsible for controlling visual access to their bodies. Antoinette's instruction is representative of how girls such as Iona, and perhaps girls even in our own country, are taught to be embarrassed of their bodies and to be afraid of the attention it or they could garner. For Antoinette, the suppression of female sexuality affords protection in the way of limiting unwanted advances and yields freedom. Throughout the novel, Iona is taught that her body is not fully hers, but is instead constantly subject to the gaze of others, but also to touch and to violence. Yannick's text also suggests that sexual behavior that is defined as natural may be celebrated, and that unnatural desires are condemned and may be harshly punished. Perhaps the most pivotal event in the text is Owen Arthur's drowning/suicide. It depends on how you read the event. In delivering Owen Arthur's death in this way, the author offers readers a sense of satisfaction. We cheer at Owen Arthur's untimely passing. We enjoy a sense of collective relief because the threat of patriarchal overreach has been removed. Owen Arthur can no longer harm his daughter. He's no longer a threat to her or to her virginity. To explain, Owen Arthur's death comes a day after he directs his daughter to, quote, marry her suitor and go away with him, end quote. It is not enough for Iona to marry another man. Owen Arthur recognizes that his perverse desire for his daughter requires distance to be diverted. So much as Owen Arthur's death can be read as him having been called to the island as though by a siren, an alternative reading infers that he was pushed to the reef by his siren-like daughter and his refusal to let her go. His inability to pursue a legitimate union with his daughter, who was so beautiful that she could sink ships with her beauty, is what drove Owen Arthur to crash his ship into a reef near the drowned land, the island of Anegada. While Owen Arthurs drowns for his love of Iona, the women he leaves behind must cope with the consequences of his trespass upon his daughter. Ultimately, Owen Arthur dies because he is unable to conform to social norms. His inability to control his unnatural desire leads him to commit suicide. So now we're kind of switching gears a little bit, and we're moving on to talk about beach privatization and how that functions in the novel. Paralleling Yannick's discussion of women's bodies is her treatment of the Caribbean environment. Yannick pairs a look into the consequences of patriarchal power with a critique of beach privatization. In Land of Love and Drowning, resistance to beach privatization comes in the form of the BOM, or the Beach Occupation Movement and Bacchanal. An unnamed narrator explains, "We were marching on the sand and doing wade-ins and soak-ins, and for those who could, swim-ins, running to the beaches in the middle of the night past the guards and the dogs. Specifically, protesters pretended to be Afro-American tourists by donning hats, cover-ups, sunglasses, and sandals. Once on the beach, the protesters reveal themselves, turn on a radio, scream, 'We is the Virgin Islands,' rip off their costumes, and run into the water. This humorously subversive act of announcing themselves and taking back the beach often resulted in calls to the police and the dissidents in jail. Motivated by the contrast between locals who are faced with no trespassing signs and tourists who are invited onto the beaches, protesters combine activism and pleasure by bringing coolers of rum and coke to the beach, hence the term bacchanal." And here we have a sign, I'd say within the past 2 years, that was put up in St. Thomas in response to beach privatization there. And one more also in St. Thomas, a no trespassing sign, and there's barbed wire in the background as well. In fictionalizing the beach access movement in the Virgin Islands, Yannick calls the efficacy of public trust doctrine into question. Although the public trust doctrine holds that certain natural and cultural resources are protected for public use, the residents in Land of Love and Drowning are often blocked from accessing the island's beaches. According to public trust doctrine, the land above the mean high tide land or dry sand is often privately owned. So that would be all the land here and to the left. And that the public has a right to use the lands and waters to the land seaward of that line, so everything to the right of that line. Currently, the U.S. Virgin Islands upholds the principles of the public trust doctrine through the Open Shorelines Act, which is the same act that's mentioned in the novel. While the act is in place and today is still enforceable, hotels are getting craftier, and in some cases are finding indirect ways of limiting access, and they're often getting away with it. The residents in Yannick's novel, through their protest, fight uncontrolled development and assert that they should have equal access to the shoreline. In 1971, the protest resulted in the creation of an Open Beaches Committee and the Open Shorelines Act. Although the Open Shorelines Act cemented a right of public use to the coastal zone, access to that zone today is not effectively enforced. As Yannick explains, the BOM movement was short-lived. Within 1 month, the protest was over. The Free Beach Act, officially termed the Virgin Islands Open Shorelines Act, was passed shortly thereafter. When the legislation went into effect, the, quote, last mean hotel and the last stingy family had to take down their private signs and remove their chains. Locals lay on the beach and felt their self-worth rise with the tide, end quote. With the use of the word chains, Yannick connects present-day economic disparity with the island's history of imperialism and servitude. I find her critique of tourism perhaps more interesting, though. This is a common sight. We saw one cruise ship in Martinique. When discussing life after the BOM movement, Yannick states that, this is the quote up here, authenticity, which was really poverty, was pulling in the tourists once again. This brings me to wonder what Yannick means by authenticity. Is authenticity similar to paradise in that both are cliche constructs? And then for you, I would think that each of us should ask, what does it mean to travel? What does it mean to go somewhere authentic? What does it mean to seek that out? And that's something that I'm hoping that we can talk about today. But now we're again kind of shifting gears. With my discussion of Dennis Ben's Here Comes the Sun, we moved to the island of Jamaica, here with a beautiful waterfall. Jamaica, a major player in the Caribbean tourist industry, attracts over 3.5 million visitors a year. Because tourism is a top industry on the island, Jamaica has had few options but to expand tourism. and to open tourists. As a recent New York Times article explains, glossy videos and magazine advertising showcase a paradise island of multiple attractions, including ecotourism, bohemian tourism, spa, and wellness tourism. In a successful promotional campaign, Jamaica popularized the saying, "Once you know, you go." And we have that here. And then also on the next slide, this image is courtesy of sandals. And I think it again speaks to class and racial disparities. Most certainly, we can talk about this after, but I find this image particularly disturbing for a couple of reasons. Moving back to the text, though. Texts such as Dennis Ben's illustrate that much work remains to be done. We would be remiss to forget that at the center of Jamaica's ethnic and political complexity is race. The social and economic division between mostly white haves and mostly black have-nots runs deep on the island. While this division is reflected at the resort at the center of Dennis Ben's novel, it is also apparent in advertising campaigns such as this one. Behind the steel gates of resorts such as Celebration Jamaica Hotel and Resort, a 90-acre property set to open within 3 years, will be English-speaking bartenders, housekeepers, and porters who are available to greet tourists with a drink and a smile. Celebration Jamaica Hotel and Resort will be an integrated casino resort. And here's a recent headline of Jamaica's approval of casino resort projects. The company's second resort, Harmony Cove, will span 2,300 acres and will feature a casino, golf courses, a luxury spa, and entertainment centers. You won't even have to leave the property. Celebration Jamaica and Harmony Cove are reflective of Jamaica's trend towards mass tourism. And here we have the artist renderings. These are set to open in about 3 years. And we have an aerial shot of hotel development in Jamaica. And then a similar shot from St. Thomas showing 5 popular resorts. And then the ever lovely Anthony Bourdain. This is a clip from Parts Unknown. He traveled to Jamaica in 2014. So I'll just cue this up. So moving back to the novel. Like Yannick's Land of Love and Drowning, Here Comes the Sun is Dennis Ben's debut novel. While Yannick details a resident-led protest, Dennis Ben explores the impact of resort development through the character of Margot and the resort that she works at. As a recent NPR interview explains, the characters in Here Comes the Sun are working-class women. They struggle with money, sexuality, and pressures of tourism squeezing their small community of Riverbank. Much like the contrast that Bourdain observes, Margot experiences the sharp contrast between her home and work environments. Dennis Ben begins her investigation into development with a depiction of tourists. In the novel, tourists, quote, dress like they're going on safari, especially the men, with their clogs, khaki apparel, and binocular-looking cameras. They eat fried fish, their backs, shoulders, and faces red from sunburn, their tour buses parked out front, end quote. And I have a couple of images that show that. So this is a clip from Sandals Montego Bay with the lovely swim-up bar. And then I have one more clip talking about tourism. This one's from the movie Life in Debt. It's based on a text by Jamaica Kincaid, and the film was released in 2001. Unfortunately, that's all I have. You should watch the film, though. In the film Life and Debt and Here Comes the Sun, tourists do not fit in. Their skin simply cannot withstand the harsh rays of the Caribbean sun. They come to document through photos rather than to experience, to be chauffeured from stop to stop along a tightly controlled itinerary. The film and the novel offer an especially critical view of fenced-in, all-inclusive resorts. At hotels such as Palm Star Resorts, the central resort in the novel, Jamaican chefs are fired and foreign ones are hired because, quote, tourists want to eat their own food on the island. They don't come to eat spicy Jamaican food, end quote. At Palm Star Resort, vacation is not about cultural exchange. Instead, it's a time for visitors to lie flat on their backs and bellies in the bright sun, while maids dash in and out of the rooms with mops and linens. Palm Star, while a fictional resort, is an example of how all-inclusives are built around security, wherein the guests arrive and they're on property for most of their stay. And not to pick on Sandals, but I have another image. This is their property in White House, and what I find really disturbing is the sentence, an all beachfront oasis amidst a 500-acre nature preserve. Like maybe is it problematic that they're destroying nature to build this hotel? Again, I'm hoping we can talk about this afterwards. And then a clip from a new film. This is called Jamaica for Sale. It was released in 2006, I guess not really that new, but it's showcasing the cost of hotel development on the island. And again, we'll see barbed wire, we'll see no trespassing signs, we'll see tour buses, and we'll see steel gates. So what's really interesting is the way that the author combines tourism and sex tourism in the novel. So Dennis Ben quickly reveals that Margot's real job is to provide sexual services to vacationers at the hotel. Readers learn that she goes to the employee restroom to freshen up and powder her face before sauntering to the client's room. She doesn't see it as demeaning. She sees it as merely satisfying the curiosity of foreigners. Foreigners who pay her, quote, good money to be their personal tour guide on the island of her body, end quote. Ironically, the very tourists who remain huddled behind security gates, unwilling to sample jerk chicken, are the ones who pay for sex acts from an exotic woman. And exotic is the term that's used in the text. In the halls of the marbled interior with French and Italian restaurants and grounds so expansive that tourists have to leave the lobby and drive half a mile to be reminded that they're outside their own country. Margot is intimate with paying clients each night. While tourism can provide positive host-guest interaction, sex tourism functions as an economic sector and is in fact a common practice in many Caribbean islands. Specifically, the idea that young brown or black women are naturally sexy and desire to have sex with much older white men enables tourists to deny any exploitative aspects of their relationship with the Caribbean. On a community level, sex tourism is stigmatized, and Margot feels that stigmatization. It is viewed as morally corrupt and socially deviant. For Margot, though, sex work affords a deep calm, a refuge in which she hides. Margot is able to be intimate with men like Horace, his skin red from a week in the sun, by imagining his eyes as those of Verdine, her lover. While with Horace, Margot utilizes a survival strategy when she sees Verdine's feminine lips parting, hungry for more than Margot's body. Horace, Margot's oldest client and a man who has a wife and 2 smiling yellow-haired children, justifies his infidelity by convincing himself that he is saving her. He even promises to take her back with him to Germany. With this passage, the author paints Horace as a somewhat desperate figure. When he pays Margot $300, it allows him to feel temporarily superior to the uninhibited woman he frequents. By developing a character who utilizes her sexuality and who later recruits a host of young women into the business, Dennis Ben highlights the economic conditions that make choices like this necessary. In painting Margot as a woman who refuses offers to be saved, because refusing keeps the clients coming back, the author complicates traditional gender and class-based power relations. Along with servicing tourists, Margot has a long-standing relationship with Alfonso Wellington, the owner of Palm Star Resorts. Margot initially sues with Alfonso to obtain tuition money for her younger sister, hoping to keep her sister out of the business. But Margot's involvement in sex work shifts when Alfonso approaches her with a business proposition. And here we have this. Alfonso says, "The 2 of us can profit from this. You give me 50% of your profit and I make you into a wealthy woman. You know how some hotels sell weed on their property? It's good business. Make foreign money. We'll sell sex, lots of it. You will recruit and train young girls you see fit for the business. You'll be the boss lady in charge." While Margot flirts with rejecting this proposition because she's reminded of her lover, Verdine, and the judgment that she might render, she is moved by the money and agrees to the arrangement. As the boss lady, Margot deploys psychological tactics and the law of supply and demand to manipulate clients as she draws upon racialized sexual fantasies. Margot works as a sexual agent who is both shaped by and shapes the local economic forces. For instance, Margot renders men helpless when she tells them that a particular girl they requested is not available. No one has ever made them feel so dependent. Margot, through the women she employs, exerts power by controlling their availability, which turns their bodies into assets for her and commodities for the clients. By developing a boss lady who herself was sold into sex work, Dennis Ben highlights the traumatic and cyclical impact of sex tourism on vulnerable populations. Under Alfonso's plan, Margot becomes known as the biggest pimp on the North Coast. The individual who managed the hotel they're destroying the town of Riverbank to build. As in Yannick's Land of Love and Drowning, we see the pervasive overreach of power. By explicitly connecting tourism, sex tourism, and environmental destruction, Yannick and Dennis Ben point to the often unexplored consequences of tourism. And this next slide might shock you, so just be prepared. This 66-year-old American is David Strecker, and he's often referred to as the world's most famous sex tourist. In 2013, he wrote a book citing his expertise in, quote, courting women of negotiable affection, end quote, his words. The book was so outrageous that it was banned from Amazon. He, last September, was arrested in Costa Rica on charges of promoting prostitution. So prostitution is legal in Costa Rica, but pimping and soliciting is not legal. That's why he was arrested. He's facing trial. The trial was supposed to be this September. It's been pushed back a bit. Strecker is proud to have slept with at least 2,500 women under the age of 25 and has traveled to Costa Rica over 40 times. He's been to the Dominican Republic many, many times, lots of countries in the Caribbean. He estimates that approximately 10% of the nation's tourists in Costa Rica visit specifically to have sex with prostitutes there. He goes by the nickname of Cuba Dave. He developed it as a brand name. He had a website and social media pages. He had a blog, but that's since been removed. But the blog featured his sexual adventures in Latin American countries. And then we have another. This is a company called Global Fantasies. It provides adult sex vacations and getaways. The slogan for the company is sensual companions and luxury accommodations in safe and festive global locations. Locations include the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Brazil, and Thailand. The company has offices in Los Angeles, Sydney, London, and Hong Kong, and they feature a 24-hour turnaround on any requests. Along with highlighting the cost of tourism, Yannick and Dennis Ben comment on the expectations we hold of ourselves and those we place upon others. The authors detail the emotional consequences of exclusion by developing characters who are denied refuge by their larger communities. In particular, the authors link social norms and alienation to highlight the power of culturally enforced expectations. For Iona and Margot, the women in each novel, the Western construct of paradise is incompatible with their current living situation. Because they cannot conform to social expectations, they construct alternative versions of paradise for themselves. Likely in reaction to the repressive conditions she lives under, Margot dreams of leaving Jamaica. To provide a bit of context, in 2006, Time magazine branded Jamaica as, quote, the most homophobic place on earth, end quote. It is amidst this environment that Margot longs to get as far away as possible, maybe America, England, or someplace where she can reinvent herself, become someone new and uninhibited, a place where she can indulge the desires she has resisted for so long. Margot, someone who has long performed the role of uninhibited island girl with her clients, feels that her life does not align with her desires. In being what others imagine their ideation of an exotic woman, Margot has lost herself and now sees migration as the only way to bring change to her life. Although Margot dreams of a life with Verdine in a beachfront villa away from prying eyes, she trades that dream for an office with good air conditioning, a mahogany desk, a chair that adjusts to her back, and a door she can keep locked. Margot no longer has to engage in sex work for sustenance. Instead, she is the boss lady behind the scenes in the fancy office, out of the way but with a view. But I ask you, is she not also selling herself as well? In Here Comes the Sun, Dennis Ben suggests that conceptions of paradise can shift. Through parallel views of personal and political overreach, the novel paints paradise as individually as well as socially constructed. And I know if you're really familiar with the show Gaycation, it's on Viceland, but this was an episode that aired in March And I'll stop just a little bit through. For essence of time, I'll pause there. I'm going to shift one more time to talking about the natural environment. In Here Comes the Sun, Dennis Ben highlights the environmental impact of tourism. For instance, the Wellington family, who originally from Canada, arrived in Jamaica because Alfonso's father fell in love with the country and stayed. Central to the author's discussion of the loss of refuge is the privatization of beaches. Dennis Ben writes, "The construction workers with their tools aren't on site today. There's a sign that reads no trespassing on the beach. The hotels are building along the coastlines. Slowly but surely they are coming like a dark sea." With this, the author positions residents as trespassers who are denied access to the coast. In evoking the imagery of the sea and connecting hotels with the sea, Dennis Ben depicts the sprawl of resorts as an invading force. This ominous force leaves residents without access to public land and enforces class and racial division between those who have access to the beach and those who do not. In essence, paradise for many is being lost and is being sold to the highest bidder. With little regard for the families who live there, the developers, who used to wait for landslides and other natural disasters to do their dirty work, now utilize force to clear entire towns. By repeating the term dirty work, first used when discussing Margot's occupation, Dennis Ben questions who is really doing the dirty work. Is it the sex worker who sleeps with foreign clients, the developers who displace entire towns, or both? Similar to the bomb movement in Yannick's novel, tensions between residents and developers flare. Developers bemoan the difficulties of extracting people from their homes and seek a government contract to enforce their commands. Their materials waste away in the sun, battered by the elements. As Dennis Ben explains, the bulldozers appear overnight. They stand in place like resting mammoths, their blades like curved tusks. It's as though they landed from the sky or were washed ashore. One by one, they begin to knock down trees in the cove and along the river. They also take a chunk of the hill, cutting down the trees that cradle the limestone, which they chip away. In this passage, the bulldozers function as alien figures that systematically erode the landscape. The bulldozers, like the tourists, do not belong. The bulldozers remove the natural defenses of protected spaces. They chip away at the balance that existed prior to their arrival. Perhaps an ironic representation of the hordes of tourists who invade the island's beaches. The bulldozers function as agents of the developers. They destroy the environment and serve as a literary representation of the way that those in charge, most notably Alfonso Wellington, relieve themselves of responsibility. The bulldozers give those in power a way out by partially alleviating their discomfort. Because the developers are not directly operating the bulldozers, they can point to others, who in this case are foreign workers, as being the agents of destruction. Much like the yellow tape all over town, the bulldozers serve as a warning that in a matter of weeks, Riverbank will be no more. This culminates in a letter to residents that informs them that failure to vacate their homes by the requested date of August the 1st will result in forced evacuation. And this isn't just fictional stuff. So this is a screenshot from a news article showing the loss of life that happened in Trinidad when bulldozers destroyed turtle hatchlings and eggs. And then one more clip. This is from a film called Earth, Water, Woman. It was released in 2013, and it showcases reforestation efforts in Trinidad. So near the conclusion of Here Comes the Sun, a local newspaper profiles Alfonso Wellington as a hotel owner / developer who is changing Jamaica for the better. Does Dennis Ben aim for a collective eye roll? I suspect so. We have a slide on economics. With the International Monetary Fund, an international organization that promotes sustainable economic growth, recognizing that it is common for only 20% of revenue to be returned to the local economy, Dennis Ben's text sheds light on the economic and environmental realities of mass tourism. Collectively, Land of Love and Drowning and Here Comes the Sun expose resorts and beaches as places of false refuge for tourists as well as residents. The shacks and wire fences that the authors include in their works are often absent from magazine covers and Instagram photos. In addition to problematizing mass tourism, Yannick and Dennis Ben call the ethics of development into question. Although the bomb movement in Land of Love and Drowning unites residents in protest, there is no such movement in Dennis Benn's text. Instead, Here Comes the Sun calls readers to meditate upon the personal, political, and cultural costs of mass tourism. Margot, who stands at the top of the hill, has hired employees to populate her property because she cannot stand being alone. Here Comes the Sun concludes with these lines, quote, "Everything glitters in the new sunlight, just like Margot had always thought it would, except for her lone, grainy figure on the water's surface, dark in the face of the sun," end quote. In contrast with the force of the sea, the sun exposes truths the characters wish to ignore. Margot, as an agent of development and someone who is implicated in the growth of sex tourism on the island, and has greatly profited from it, cannot escape the rays of the sun that expose her sense of alienation. Margot, as a pimp as well as a lesbian, crosses social norms and defies the heteropatriarchy, the combination of heterosexism and patriarchy that privileges the heterosexual and the masculine. Owen Arthur, a man who cannot conform to masculine ideals, commits suicide to resolve his sexual deviancy. Hence, both works focus on the relationship between desire and power. In Land of Love and Drowning and Here Comes the Sun, Yannick and Dennis Benn utilize the natural elements of the sea and the sun to highlight the external forces that are threatening the Caribbean environment and the people who live there. In the works I've discussed, development functions as unchecked power, and the authors are critical of the desire to alter the natural landscape. In both novels, power roams unchecked. While sexual overreach supports the continuation of patriarchal power, ineffective land use regulations yields profits. Together, the novels point to tourism, sex tourism, and beach privatization as inherently connected and equally problematic. As I suggested at the start of my talk, questions surrounding socially responsible development are not limited to the Caribbean. In California, homeowners are fighting to retain sole access to beaches, and here we have a protest near Martins Beach in California. There are many others like this. In North Dakota, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe is countering construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And here we have a protest in St. Thomas that's in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. As we conclude, I would like to return to the concept of paradise and how paradise is constructed. I'm realizing that I may have left you today with more questions and answers, and maybe you have questions about what it means to visit the Caribbean. But that's the value of what we do here in the College of Humanities. Thank you so much for joining me in this investigation of tourism, sex tourism, and beach privatization in the contemporary Caribbean. Thank you.